Well, now let's check out the next key revision, and that is object-oriented programming and active record topics. And we're going to query the teacher-related data from within a teacher class, protecting the teacher data. Let's see what that actually means. But before doing this, our plan is basically reduce to the minimum this code that is in here. We have been doing already so. We have created, abstracted the video interface by creating our own class database helper. But it can be drastically improved. Here what we are doing is querying teacher data. Imagine that you have this application uses different tables. And if you have to present those different data from different tables, wouldn't it be nice if we can reorganize in a way that every single data related to a specific table could just be in one place and not all over in the index or the presentation layer. So we're going to use, of course, object-oriented for that, and we're going to look into how that is done. So here, in this new code, this new class appears. Let's have a look at our directory. Still have my public folder, the index, and in the private, I have one more class now, the teacher class. Because I am dealing with acquiring the teachers table at the database layer, it would be nice if I have a object in RAM memory while running the application on the browser that represents a record on the database. So that's kind of my final goal. That's why we are trying to do or implement the active record design pattern, which basically means create for a teacher row in the database table an object at the PHP application level. Of course, if we want to achieve that, we're gonna need a teacher class, and in that class we're gonna need, if I want to query, we're gonna need this access to the database connection. And the first thing you see here is exactly that, a database variable that is going to be or represent the database helper that I previously defined over here, this one. A teacher class is defined in the database variable, which is the database helper, and from there I can connect and query or send my queries, whatever queries I define. If you quickly look into the method, one of the methods of this teacher class, you will see that I'm finding all the teachers in this method, find all. So whenever I need on my presentation layer, I need all the teachers, basically what I would do is put that result into a variable in the index and just call the class, the class's method, nothing else. So as you can see, our application is taking a bit of shape now. Of course, I have this database. It needs to be known by the class, but it's going to be protected and it's going to be a static. Well, a static, that's if you're new to this keyword, well, it simply means that you don't need an instantiation. You don't need a teacher object in order to access this variable, in order to set this variable. And that's easily explained because I can have 50, 100 teacher objects, but they all will be connected to this one. And that's why I have static variable here representing the database helper. But of course it's protected, and which means nobody outside this from the outside world will access the database. So for that I will need to set that variable, and this method does it. So of course it's going to be static. I don't need an object to set this database to call this method, and yes, this is public, and therefore I can call it from the outside world, and that's exactly what I'm doing in the index.php. First, teacher set the database, and I'm creating a new database helper. Then we can have, of course, this method which closes the database, and you already know what's happening behind the scenes, right? It's basically destroying the video object, and we can find in the database helper. This one, we're setting to null. Here you go. And in the find all, we are basically querying our database. So as you can see, of course, first connecting and then querying it and putting it into a result and returning that result. The self that you see here, you actually see it in here, is referring to, of course, the class. And we are not saying this because the view can recall the difference between this and self is actually this referring to the current object that is calling the specific method. But if you don't have any object, like it's in this case, we don't have teachers objects whatsoever yet, and then you should use the self, because then it's the use of a static method, and that's how you do it. Same's happening here. After we do this, we have our organized code under teacher. Then we can simply on the presentation layer set the database and query the database, wrap the result, and of course the fetching continues. This code is exactly the same as previously shown, and finally closing the database. But the change is here. Now we're using our teacher class for that, because this is teacher related process. So it's still not fully active record oriented, but we will see that in a moment. For that, I like to check this out. Instantiation of a teacher objects based on database manually. And okay, this is not complete, but let's have a look at this. And now I'm going to try to instantiate teacher objects based on the result that I've got from the query. So let's get back to our teacher class. Let me close this one. Now we really start seeing the magic and the power of this concept, active record design pattern. What we do have here is the variables, and these variables actually, well, at this moment they can be anything, but my goal would be having these variables matching the columns values coming from the database. So every time I create a teacher, I can see in the database these columns. So my goal would be that these columns become properties at this level, the application level. In order to do that, let's instantiate some objects based on the result that we queried. Still, I have my same code here, setting the database, closing the database, and in the find all, I'm going to modify how the function works. So first of all, I am getting my result from the database, right? In other words, the box. Whenever I query the database, I get a box, remember that. And once I have my result, before returning it for displaying on the presentation layer in the index.php, I'm going to create objects of type teacher, okay? So for that, I'm going to need a teachers array, and then I'm going to fetch or unbox this result sent by the database, MySQL database. So while doing this, result as row, I'm going to catch this row, and I'm doing this manually, of course, for learning purposes, but it would be nice if we can do these steps that I'm going to show you here automatically. But we will see that in the next revision. So let's have a look what's happening when we unbox row by row. What we're doing is create an instance of this new self, means a new teacher, because that's the class where I'm at the moment. Once I have that, I would then assign a value to each of these properties that I find here in the teacher class. So for now, I'm going to get object first name, which is going to be the first teacher's, if it's the first iteration, it's going to be the first teacher's name. And yeah, I assigned whatever is coming from the database, row name. Remember that I am fetching it as row, so I can get the property value in this way. And the same holds for the date of birth. I'm doing it in this line. So I'm assigning values that are being fetched, or that were fetched, and put it into these variables of the first object. The second iteration, or the second row, if there is a second row, is exactly going to do the same. Create a new object and assign those properties to that newly created teacher object. And of course, every time I'm creating an object, I don't want the object to disappear. I'm going to put it into the teachers array. And once I have collected all the teachers that I unboxed in this array, then I'm going to return the entire array, which contains all the teachers or basically where the result of this line of code. So all the teachers from teachers table. Now it might look the same as we previously had, but this is entirely different. The paradigm here is using the power of an active record concept. What I can do now is simply go or iterate through that array, teachers array, is define or is the object containing this time all the array of teachers, because I'm calling these teachers find all, and find all is returning basically an array of teachers. So I'm not returning anymore just the result for me to fetch it, but it has happened already. I just returning the actual objects and at the application level now. That means that now I can manipulate those objects by just simply putting outputting in this way using the teacher for each iteration for each teacher in the array. I'm just going to display the teacher's first name and teacher's date of birth. And that's how active record design pattern now starts taking shape and allow us to be way more flexible and also reuse our code as much as possible and having in a well-structured way. Now, of course, this drastically needs to be improved, because if you look at the database and you compare with these variables here, you will see that they don't match all the values, all the columns and the properties. So we still need to improve that. You see here, I have many more columns than in the teacher object. So the instantiation of every teacher is not really a proper one yet, but we will see in the next one. Of course, and let me just deploy this, and the result, we're expecting it the same. Here it is. Now let's have a look at the how we can automatically instantiate a teacher object that perfectly reflects a teacher row at the database level. So let's check out this revision. And let's see what the changes we have made here. So now I do have something that reflects ideally my rows in the database. So every time I'm instantiating the object, let's see how that is done, because we briefly have refactored our code in the find all. Let's just get rid of these implementations. So our focus should be in here, the find all. And we did in the previous revision code is manually. Now what we are doing is instantiate the object based on whatever columns coming from the database, but that's happening automatically now. Okay, so this should not be here anymore, because we're going to see what's going on. So whenever we shoot a query, or we execute this specific query, select everything from teachers, we're finding all the teachers. What we're going to do is basically, of course, after connecting to the database, querying the database, we're going to instantiate objects for every result, for every item in that result, in that box that we get from the database, right? So here we start doing that. So now instead of doing it manually, I'm just going to do it automatically, but I have refactored this code. So we are going simply calling a method now. Just we wrap all that code into a method, which is called instantiate, and we pass each row. On every iteration you get a row of each teacher, you could say, a record, and we call this other function over here, and then we can proceed with creating our teacher object dynamically. And I say dynamically because here you don't see me typing every single property here and assigning a value coming from the database. I'd rather do that automatically, and that's a smart code. So how is that happening? Of course, I need a new instance of this class, in this case teacher. Hence that this is also static, because in the very beginning I do not have any teacher object, so but still I need this method to start creating objects, and that's why I'm having this method as a static option there. So well, this is the important code. What I'm basically doing, fetching every row that I get from this, every row that I get from here, or passing it as a parameter, I'm going to I'm going to fetch it as property and value. So I'm going to treat this as an associative array. We already know this, what an associative array is. So what I'm going to do then is assign the object property, and that means whatever property I find in this specific class. The object is a teacher. Remember, it's a teacher object. So I'm going to iterate, because it's a for each, through each property, and I'm going to assign that specific value. Remember that each row is coming in an associative way. So that allows me to put the values one by one into properties. But here you should look carefully. Let me just zoom in, that I'm not doing object property, but I am actually indicating that this is the variable. Dynamically, I want the record iterate through each of these ones. So I don't know which one first, but it's coming from the database. Okay, so which is ID. I know I have already matched the column with these properties, so I know those properties will be created in here. And then I'm assigning that a specific value. So the columns are becoming, on this line, the columns are becoming properties, with the values, of course, coming from the database. And then after I have that, all the properties, all the columns have become properties of this new teacher. I'm returning that object, and then I can continue execution of this code, which is returning the teacher's array. Yeah. So this is exactly the same code as in the previous commit. The only thing is that we just refactored this code, so we are keeping it a little bit more organized in our methods, a little bit more compiled, and we do this automatic assignment of columns becoming properties of a teacher object. And yeah, that is it. And of course, our code remains the same. Let me refresh this one. I just uploaded, deployed, so it remains the same. Code in here. These are my name. I do not have the other columns, but that's by design, because in the front end I only have these two columns assigned. So if I could do just duplicate this and access what's the other column. Let's say scale, and I have 2, and then I could just of course still do this scale over there. I'm gonna save it and deploy it and refresh it, and you will see that the first value is null, so that's why not appearing. But this, all the two records have these two teachers have a scale 10. So yeah, object-oriented it makes my application code reusable, much better, modular, and easy to access.